discarded to freeze in a rusted truck, a haunted and homeless Navy SEAL veteran used his final pitiful settlement check to buy Cutler's Folly, a barren, notoriously cursed island off the brutal coast of Maine. His corrupt former commander was absolutely certain he had successfully silenced a broken soldier, banishing him to rot on a worthless, isolated rock. He had no idea this desolate, ignored wasteland was hiding a staggering, deadly secret just beneath the dirt. And the traitorous commander certainly didn't know that the very place where he sent his former soldier to disappear would unexpectedly hand the veteran the ultimate weapon to destroy his entire criminal syndicate. Nathan Gallagher was a ghost of a man, living in the rusted shell of a 2004 Ford F-150. 3 years ago, he was a chief petty officer in SEAL Team 6, kicking down doors in the dead of night and executing high-stakes raids under the command of Captain William Hayes. Now, he was a drifter on the fringes of Portland, Maine, surviving on cold canned soup and the erratic grace of a broken system. The transition from elite warrior to forgotten veteran had been brutally swift. A shrapnel wound to his right femur ended his physical career, while the invisible shrapnel of severe PTS had systematically dismantled his personal life. His only tether to sanity was Titan. Titan was a 70-pound Belgian Malinois, a retired Navy SEAL K-9, who had served alongside Nathan in 3 different combat zones. The dog was missing half of his left ear and carried a jagged scar across his snout from a close-quarters blast in Fallujah. They were 2 broken weapons the military no longer needed, discarded to navigate the civilian world alone. Nathan's luck shifted on a freezing Tuesday morning when a thick manila envelope arrived at a local P.O. box. It was a retroactive settlement from the Department of Defense regarding hazard pay and medical compensation that had been tied up in bureaucratic red tape for years. Inside was a cashier's check for $72,500. For a man sleeping in his truck, it was a fortune. But Nathan didn't want a house in the suburbs, and he didn't want to integrate into a society that felt impossibly loud and chaotic. He wanted isolation. Extreme, absolute isolation. Sitting in the local public library, Nathan scrolled through obscure real estate listings until he found it. Cutler's Folly. It was a jagged 7-acre rock off the treacherous northern coast of Maine, completely cut off from the mainland. The listing photos showed a desolate spit of land covered in dead skeletal pine trees and a single dilapidated wooden cabin. The price was absurdly low, listed at $45,000, having sat on the market for an astonishing 48 years. The listing explicitly stated as is, no utilities, unmarketable title, cash only. Within the hour, Nathan was sitting in the suffocatingly warm office of Harrison Trent, an aging real estate broker whose suit hung entirely too loose on his frame. "You want Cutler's Folly?" Trent asked, his voice cracking as he peered over his bifocals. He looked at Nathan, clear his throat, then down at the quiet, intense Malinois, sitting dutifully at the veteran's boots. Trent began sweating, dabbing his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. "Mr. Gallagher, I have to be honest with you. That property it's a liability. It's impossible to sell. The tides are violent, the soil is dead, and nobody has set foot on that island since 1978. There's a reason it's cheap." "I don't care," Nathan said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. "I'll give you $40,000 for it right now, cashier's check." Trent stared at the check, then back at Nathan. The broker's hands were visibly shaking as he hurriedly pulled the ancient yellow deed from a dusty filing cabinet. It was as if Trent couldn't get rid of the paper fast enough. He didn't argue the price drop. He didn't try to upsell. He just frantically stamped the documents. "There is one peculiar stipulation in the original deed," Trent mumbled, pointing a trembling finger at a line of faded text. You own the surface, but a holding company from the 1960s, Apex Logistics, technically retained the subterranean rights. It doesn't mean much. It's solid granite. Just legal mumbo-jumbo. Nathan signed the papers without a second thought. He didn't care about subterranean rights. He just wanted the surface. 2 days later, Nathan spent another $3,000 on a beat-up aluminum skiff with an old outboard motor. He loaded the boat with survival gear, MREs, meals ready to eat, a heavy-duty tactical flashlight, his car-bar knife, and bags of high-protein dog food. The locals at the marina watched him load the boat with a mixture of pity and dread. An old lobsterman named Elias Cobb spat chewing tobacco onto the docks and shook his head. "You ain't going to last a week out there, soldier," Elias warned. His eyes narrowed against the freezing wind. Cutler's Folly is a bad place. The birds don't even land on it. It's too quiet. Snorts. And when the fog rolls in, things get confused out there. Nathan didn't reply. He untied the lines, pulled the rip cord on the outboard motor, and steered the skiff into the choppy grey Atlantic. Titan stood at the bow, his nose twitching as he took in the heavy salt air. The journey took 2 grueling hours through punishing swells. When Cutler's Folly finally materialized through the dense sea mist, it looked less like an island and more like a tombstone rising out of the ocean. Jagged black rocks formed a natural, treacherous perimeter. The shoreline was littered with decades of driftwood that looked like bleached bones. At the center of the island stood the cabin, a sagging, rotted construction that seemed to lean away from the wind. Nathan dragged the skiff onto a narrow patch of rocky beach and secured it. He took a deep breath. For the first time in 3 years, the crushing anxiety in his chest began to ease. There were no sirens here, no crowds, no sudden noises, just the rhythmic, endless crashing of the waves. He had finally found his sanctuary, or so he thought. The interior of the cabin was exactly what Nathan expected. A graveyard of forgotten furniture covered in thick layers of dust and rat droppings. He spent the remaining daylight hours sweeping out the debris, laying out his sleeping bag, and boarding up a broken window with scrap wood to block the biting wind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted, and an unnatural darkness swallowed the island. There was no light pollution out here. The darkness was absolute. Nathan lit a kerosene lantern, its warm orange glow casting long, dancing shadows against the rotting walls. He cracked open an MRE and shared a portion of the dried beef with Titan. For a few hours, everything was peaceful. Nathan read a paperback novel, and Titan slept heavily by his feet. The dog's rhythmic breathing the only sound besides the ocean, but around 1 a.m., the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Nathan didn't hear anything, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. It was a visceral, biological reaction, the same phantom warning he used to get in the narrow alleys of a combat zone right before an ambush. His heart rate spiked. At his feet, Titan's eyes snapped open. The Malinois didn't whine. He didn't bark. Barking was for civilian dogs. Navy SEAL K-9S are trained to be completely silent when tracking a threat, communicating solely through body language. Titan stood up, his posture instantly transforming from a resting pet to a lethal, coiled spring. The thick fur along his spine stood straight up, his ears pinned back, and his nose dropped toward the floorboards, sniffing frantically. "What is it, boy?" Nathan whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for the crowbar knife resting on his rucksack. Titan ignored him. The dog began pacing the perimeter of the small cabin, his nose dragging along the baseboards. He paused near the center of the room, scratched violently at a rotting rug, and then looked back at Nathan. Titan's eyes were wide, fixated on the floor. Nathan grabbed his tactical flashlight and stepped over to the rug. He kicked it aside. Underneath, the floorboards were warped and water-damaged, but completely solid. Nothing was there. "You're spooking yourself, buddy," Nathan muttered, though his own pulse was pounding in his ears. But Titan wasn't done. Snorts. The dog let out a low, barely audible growl, a sound that vibrated deep in his chest and trotted to the heavy wooden door of the cabin. He sat down facing it, looking over his shoulder at Nathan. It was the K9 tactical indicator for target acquired, permission to pursue. Nathan's military instincts overrode his logic. Something was wrong. He clicked the flashlight on, chambered his grip on the heavy knife, and pushed the cabin door open. The freezing wind howled, instantly cutting through Nathan's jacket. Titan shot out of the cabin, nose to the ground, navigating the pitch-black island with terrifying speed and precision. Nathan followed the beam of his flashlight, sprinting to keep up with the dog. Titan didn't lead him toward the water. Instead, the dog darted toward the dense, tangled cluster of dead pine trees on the highest elevated point of the island. The terrain here was treacherous, covered in thick moss, loose slate, and thorny underbrush. Suddenly, Titan stopped. He was standing near the base of a massive, split boulder, scratching frantically at the earth. He was digging with a furious, desperate energy, tearing through decades of accumulated soil and dead pine needles. Nathan approached cautiously, shining Snorts, the blinding LED light, onto the spot. "Back up, Titan! Halt!" Nathan commanded. The dog instantly stopped and took 2 steps back, though his body remained entirely rigid. Nathan dropped to his knees in the freezing dirt and used his gloved hands to clear the remaining soil Titan had loosened. His fingers brushed against something hard, not rock, not wood, metal. Nathan dug faster, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He cleared a 3-foot perimeter, revealing a flat, heavy surface. He brushed the remaining dirt away, and his blood ran cold. Buried beneath the earth was a massive industrial steel hatch. It looked like the entry point to a submarine or an underground bunker. It had a heavy turning wheel in the center, but that wasn't what made Nathan's chest tighten with dread. The metal wasn't rusted. Despite the island being battered by highly corrosive salt air for decades, the steel hatch was pristine. The hinges were thick with fresh synthetic grease. The heavy steel wheel in the center was completely free of debris. Someone had been maintaining it recently. Nathan stared at the hatch, the words of the nervous real estate agent echoing in his mind. Apex Logistics retained the subterranean rights. As Nathan knelt there in the dark, the wind momentarily died down. In the sudden, suffocating silence, Titan stepped forward and pressed his ear flat against the cold steel of the hatch. Then Nathan heard it. It was faint, muffled by inches of heavy steel, but unmistakable in the dead of night. A rhythmic, mechanical humming, followed by a sharp, metallic clank. Someone or something was moving down there. The mechanical hum vibrating through the pristine steel hatch sent a surge of electricity straight to Nathan Gallagher's nervous system. For 3 years, his brain had been misfiring, flooding his body with panic in the frozen food aisle of grocery stores, or at the sudden backfire of a passing car. But here, kneeling in the freezing dirt of Cutler's Folly, with a potential tangible threat lurking just inches below him, the fog of his severe PTSD evaporated. The crushing weight of civilian life lifted, replaced immediately by the cold, calculated clarity of a chief petty officer in SEAL Team 6. Nathan was no longer a broken, homeless drifter. He was the weapon he was built to be. He signaled Titan with a sharp, downward flick of his wrist. The Belgian Malinois backed away from the hatch, flattening his dark body against the mossy earth, rendering himself practically invisible in the blackness. Nathan turned his attention back to the heavy steel wheel. It was well oiled, silently begging to be turned. He gripped the cold metal with both gloved hands and applied pressure. It didn't budge. He adjusted his stance, planting his boots firmly into the loose soil, and engaged his core, pulling with the concentrated strength of a man whose life had depended on physical endurance. With a soft, sickening click, the pressure seal disengaged. The wheel spun smoothly. Nathan gripped the handle of his car-bar knife, holding it securely in his right hand, while he used his left to lift the heavy steel plate. The hatch swung upward on silent hydraulic hinges, releasing a rush of warm, stale air that smelled strongly of ozone, copper, and synthetic machine oil. The scent was distinctly modern, entirely out of place on a cursed, uninhabited rock in the northern Atlantic. Below him lay a perfectly vertical shaft, lined with an aluminum ladder, dropping down into impenetrable darkness. The mechanical humming was louder now, a steady, rhythmic thrumming of heavy-duty ventilation systems and power generators. Nathan reached into his tactical vest, retrieved a green chemical light, snapped it, and dropped it down the shaft. The glowing tube tumbled for nearly 40 feet before hitting a solid concrete floor with a faint clatter. The eerie green illumination revealed no movement. He looked at Titan, giving a quick, double-tap gesture to his own chest. "Follow close." Nathan descended first, his boots making no sound on the aluminum rungs. He moved with practiced, fluid efficiency. His senses dialed up to their absolute maximum. The temperature rose significantly with each passing foot, transitioning from the biting Maine winter to a climate-controlled, sterile warmth. When his boots finally touched the smooth, epoxy-coated concrete floor, he stepped aside, allowing Titan to silently land beside him. The Malinois immediately took a defensive posture, his nose working frantically to dissect the environment. The shaft opened into a long, narrow corridor constructed of reinforced concrete and lined with exposed thick conduits running along the ceiling. Dim, red emergency lighting bathed the tunnel in a sinister, bloody hue. This was not a forgotten relic of the Cold War. This was an active, highly funded, state-of-the-art facility. Moving in a deep crouch, Nathan navigated the corridor, sweeping his heavy tactical flashlight across the corners, keeping the beam tight. The hallway terminated at a heavy reinforced security door equipped with a biometric keypad. However, the door was slightly ajar, propped open by a rubber wedge. Someone was incredibly careless or incredibly confident that no one would ever set foot on Cutler's Folly. Nathan slipped through the opening, Titan mirroring his exact footsteps. They entered a cavernous, subterranean room that stole the breath right out of Nathan's lungs. The space was massive, roughly the size of a gymnasium, and completely filled with row upon row of towering black server racks. Thousands of blinking blue and green LED lights pulsed in rhythm, illuminating the sterile environment. Thick bundles of fiber optic cables snaked across the ceiling, feeding into a massive central cooling unit. It was a localized, completely off-the-grid data fortress. But it wasn't just servers. Along the far wall sat a staging area. There were heavy Pelican cases stacked neatly, the kind used to transport military-grade munitions and advanced weaponry. Next to the cases were folding tables, littered with high-frequency satellite radios, encrypted laptops, and stacks of physical manifests. Nathan crept toward the tables, his eyes scanning the space for any sign of human movement. Nothing. The rhythmic clanking he'd heard from the surface was coming from an automated sump pump, violently ejecting groundwater into a drainage pipe. The facility was currently empty, but the glowing screens on the laptops indicated that it wasn't abandoned. Someone had been here just hours ago. He holstered his knife and stepped up to the primary laptop. The screen was locked, but beside it lay an open leather binder. Nathan shined his flashlight onto the documents. They were bills of lading, international shipping routes, and wire transfer confirmations totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. The cargo wasn't drugs or weapons. It was data, highly classified, deeply sensitive geopolitical data, blackmail material, satellite telemetry, defense grid layouts for the eastern seaboard of the United States. The island wasn't cursed. It was a geographic blind spot, deliberately purchased and utilized by a massive, treasonous syndicate to harbor servers containing stolen government secrets. Positioned just far enough offshore to bypass federal data jurisdictions and monitoring systems, Nathan turned the page of the binder, and his heart violently slammed against his ribs. There, stamped at the bottom of an encrypted authorization log, was a signature he recognized instantly. He had seen that precise, sharp handwriting on countless mission briefings, deployment papers, and ultimately his own medical discharge forms. Captain William Hayes, Nathan's former commanding officer. The man who had orchestrated the disastrous raid in Fallujah that destroyed Nathan's leg and scarred Titan. The man who had pushed for Nathan to be quietly discharged and forgotten, ensuring his medical files were buried in bureaucratic limbo. Hayes wasn't a hero. He was a traitor using his high-level security clearance to funnel defense secrets to holding company, Apex Logistics. And he had used the blood and sacrifice of men like Nathan as a smokescreen for his operations. A sickening realization washed over him. The retroactive settlement check, the money that allowed him to buy Cutler's Folly, wasn't a bureaucratic miracle. It was a payoff. Hayes had likely approved the back pay to keep the homeless veteran quiet, never anticipating that Nathan's profound desire for isolation would lead him to purchase the exact useless rock where Hayes hid his treason. Suddenly, Titan's ears snapped forward. The dog emitted a silent rumbling vibration in his chest and spun toward the far end of the server farm. Nathan immediately cut his flashlight. Total darkness swallowed the room, save for the blinking server lights. A heavy metallic groaning echoed from the opposite wall. It was a set of hydraulic doors opening to what must have been a subterranean docking bay connected to the ocean. The sound of sloshing water echoed through the chamber, followed by the heavy thud of combat boots hitting the concrete floor. "Get the drive swapped and initiate the purge." A harsh, clear's throat, authoritative voice echoed through the cavern. "Hayes wants this node wiped by sunrise. The feds are sniffing around the shell company." "Copy that, Lawson," the second voice replied, taking the primary servers offline now. 3 men, heavily armed private contractors, Nathan could see their silhouettes moving against the blue glow of the servers. They were carrying suppressed submachine guns and wearing tactical plate carriers. Nathan was unarmed, save for a 7-inch piece of sharpened steel. He was outnumbered, trapped 40 feet underground, and facing heavily armed mercenaries. He looked down at Titan, whose eyes, snorts, were locked onto the encroaching targets. A fierce, predatory calm settled over Nathan. They had taken his career. They had taken his peace of mind. Now they were standing in his house. He reached down and gave Titan the silent 2-finger command for lethal engagement. Clear. Hot. The mercenaries moved with a false sense of security. Their weapons lowered, entirely unaware that the darkness held a predator. Lawson, the team leader, marched toward the central server cluster. A heavy duffel bag slung over his shoulder, ready to extract the treasonous hard drives. His 2 men, Carter and Briggs, fanned out to check the perimeter, their flashlights cutting uselessly through the maze of towering black racks. Nathan used the rhythmic hum of the massive cooling units to mask his footsteps. He slipped off his boots, choosing to walk in his thick wool socks. The cold concrete bit into his feet, but it rendered him entirely silent. He was a ghost slipping between the narrow aisles of the data farm, tracking Carter, the man closest to his position. Carter turned a corner, his flashlight beam sweeping across the empty concrete. He never saw the blade. Nathan lunged from the shadows, his left hand clamping violently over Carter's mouth to muffle the scream, pulling the man off balance backward. Simultaneously, Nathan drove the car-bar knife precisely into the vulnerable gap beneath Carter's heavy ceramic armor plate, angling upward. The mercenary's body went instantly rigid, a suppressed gasp dying in his throat. Nathan lowered the lifeless 220-pound man to the floor without making a single sound, smoothly sliding the submachine gun from the mercenary's limp hands. It was an H&K MP5, fully suppressed. Nathan checked the chamber, feeling the cold, familiar mechanics of the weapon. The balance was perfect. Across the room, Lawson yelled out, "Carter, get over here and help with these encryptions. The firewall is fighting back." Silence hung heavy in the subterranean chamber. "Carter!" Lawson barked, his voice laced with sudden irritation. He looked up from the laptop. "Briggs, go find him. Tell him to stop screwing around." Briggs unslung his rifle and moved down the adjacent aisle, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically. "Carter, man, stop messing with—" A terrifying guttural snarl shattered the sterile silence of the bunker. Before Briggs could even raise his weapon, 70 pounds of heavily muscled, highly trained Belgian Malinois launched out of the blackness. Titan hit Briggs' center mass with the force of a speeding truck. The mercenary was thrown violently backward, his weapon clattering uselessly across the concrete floor. Titan's powerful jaws clamped down on Briggs's dominant forearm, the canine teeth sinking straight through the tactical fabric and into the bone with a sickening crunch. Briggs screamed, a raw, agonizing sound of pure terror, as he thrashed wildly on the ground, trying to punch the massive dog away. Titan didn't yield an inch. He shifted his grip, violently shaking his head, tearing muscle, and completely neutralizing the threat. Lawson spun around, his eyes wide with shock. He raised his weapon, aiming wildly at the thrashing shadows. "What the hell is that?" he screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Poof!" Clear's throat, and cough. "Poof!" 3 suppressed rounds cut through the air. Nathan emerged from the darkness at a dead sprint, firing from the shoulder. The first round shattered Lawson's flashlight. The second and third rounds slammed perfectly into Lawson's chest plate. The kinetic impact knocked the wind out of the mercenary, throwing him backward against the heavy metal table. Lawson gasped, struggling to bring his weapon up, but Nathan was already there. With ruthless efficiency, Nathan kicked the mercenary's rifle into the darkness, grabbed Lawson by the tactical vest, and slammed him brutally onto the concrete floor. Nathan drove his knee into Lawson's sternum, pinning him in place, and leveled the smoking barrel of the MP5 directly between the man's eyes. "Don't," Nathan whispered, his voice as cold and unforgiving as the ocean above them. Lawson froze, his chest heaving, his hands instantly raising in surrender. He looked at the scarred, intense face of the homeless veteran, then at the massive, bloody dog standing fiercely over his screaming partner. Who are you?" Lawson stammered, coughing violently. "You're not supposed to be here." "I own the property," Nathan replied evenly. "I'm just doing some renovations." Nathan zip-tied Lawson and Briggs, using their own tactical restraints, dragging them to the center of the room. He patched Briggs's bleeding arm just enough to keep the man from bleeding out. He wasn't a murderer. He was a soldier. He had secured the target. With the mercenaries neutralized, Nathan turned his attention back to the staging tables. He knew the protocol. He disconnected the heavy hard drives containing the treasonous data, wrapping them securely in static-proof bags before shoving them into his rucksack. These drives were the Holy Grail. They were the undeniable, irrefutable proof of Captain Hayes's massive criminal syndicate. A web of treason that had likely cost dozens of American lives. He found Lawson's encrypted satellite phone, cracked the security code by pressing the mercenary's bleeding thumb against the scanner, and dialed a number he hadn't thought about in 3 years. It was the direct line to a federal investigator at the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, a man who had once tried to look into Hayes's operation, but was aggressively shut down by brass. The phone rang twice. "Agent Miller," a groggy voice answered. "Miller, it's Chief Gallagher," Nathan said, his voice steady. "I have something you've been looking for. I need a secure extraction team at Cutler's Folly, coast of Maine. Bring a lot of handcuffs." By dawn, the desolate shoreline of Cutler's Folly was swarming with black tactical helicopters and heavily armed federal agents. The sheer magnitude of the discovery sent shockwaves through the Department of Defense. The drives Nathan secured unraveled a massive espionage ring. Within 48 hours, Captain William Hayes was dragged out of his home in Virginia in handcuffs, his career and his life completely dismantled. Apex Logistics was seized, its assets frozen, and its board of directors arrested. Nathan Gallagher stood on the rocky precipice of his island, watching the sun rise over the Atlantic, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold. Titan sat patiently by his side, the ocean breeze ruffling his dark fur. A federal agent approached Nathan, holding a heavy clipboard. "The government is seizing the subterranean levels, Gallagher. It's a massive crime scene." But the surface, "The deed is legally yours. Furthermore, the whistleblower bounty on an espionage case of this magnitude." The agent shook his head in disbelief. "You're never going to have to worry about money again. You could buy an island in the Bahamas." Nathan looked down at the ruined wooden cabin behind him and out at the endless crashing waves. The noise of the world was finally gone. His mind was quiet. He reached down and affectionately scratched the scarred spot behind Titan's ear. "No thanks," Nathan said softly. "Snore, Mr. Hoff. I think I'll stay right here. It's a good place for a dog." If Nathan and Titan's incredible journey of survival, justice, and redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and hit subscribe. These real-life stories of forgotten heroes finding their peace and taking down massive corruption need to be heard. Share this video with a friend who loves an unforgettable twist, and drop a comment below telling us what you would do if you found a secret bunker under your house. See you next time. Clears throat and cough. Hi, my name is Riley Collins, the owner and manager of Tampa Ruthless Hearts. After watching the video, a homeless Navy SEAL bought an impossible-to-sell island. His dog found why nobody lived there. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, the strongest feeling was seeing hope return when everything seemed lost. Even as a fictional story, it reminds us that loyalty, trust, and staying calm under pressure can uncover opportunities we never expected. Titan's bond with Nathan was something I won't forget. What part of the story surprised you the most? Do you think you would have stayed on the island after discovering its secret? Sometimes paying attention to small signs and trusting the people or pets who have earned our confidence can make all the difference. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and feel free to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more stories like this.